Hello, everyone. My name is John Desjarlais. I'm the Executive Director of the Indigenous Resource Network, and you are listening to the Indigenous Voices in Resource Development podcast. So, on this episode, you'll hear from Kaella-Marie Earle, who is Anishinaabe from Wiikwemkoong, Unceded Territory and Aroland First Nation, and proudly part of the network. So, Kaella has incredible experience, extensive experience in engineering, in science, leadership, and is currently working at Enbridge as a professional engineer in storage and transmissions. Hi, Kayla. How are you?
I am amazing. Thank you so much for having me here, John.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure. And so, I think we connected back years ago at an ACES in Canada conference. And so, those conferences bringing together Indigenous people, especially in STEM and everything like that. And so, absolutely, it was always inspiring for me to kind of connect with people and, similar lived experience, but also kind of on a professional trajectory I can kind of relate with. So that was super cool. The way we like to start these very conversational, but we start them kind of rooted in connection and kinship, right? So tell us a little bit more about you. What territory do you call home? Tell us a little bit about where you're from, your kinship ties, your community, and your extended community.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a registered member of Wiikwemkoong, like you mentioned, unceded territory, but I was born in Sudbury, which is
Hmm.
right in the middle of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 territory. My family and family members come from Wemagwans. Were related to Annamagwan, like especially on my dad's side in Wiki, and then up in Aroland. My mom is directly from Aroland First Nation, and her family is like Terrio, Gagnon. We're related to McGiskin and Mendawagan. So those are like where my family ties are from. My family is Anishinaabe, so to break that down, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi. We're distantly Cree on my mom's side, and we do have some French and German ancestry on my dad's side. In terms of where I call home, so I grew up in Sudbury. I was born here, but what really impacted me throughout my life is actually the history of Sudbury. So Sudbury is actually a mining central of the world. At one time, it was the capital of nickel mining in the world. And so here is where the front line of a lot of mining conflict and environmental devastation conflict and oppression of Indigenous human rights conflict has occurred historically. And so I kind of grew up in this space where a lot of innovation occurred in that like area of expertise.
Hmm.
And from that incredible level of environmental devastation, Sudbury has been a world leader in environmental remediation, a world leader in innovation in mining and like electrifying mining fleets. And then also, I'm very proud to say that in my territory, we have set legal precedent when it comes to the recognition of Indigenous rights in terms of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And I was one of the first students actually at my university to hold a Robinson-Huron Treaty gathering for students in particular, with some of the chief litigators and the chief plaintiff came, Mike Restuel, to talk to students right before they won this like precedent-setting case for Canada, which has resulted in a chain of events. There's a number of other First Nations who are litigating and asserting their rights in the Supreme Court as a result of all of the work that our territories have done together. And so a lot of those things have heavily impacted I guess my
Hmm.
belief in myself, my belief in my people, and how strongly I feel about the assertion of our rights and using the assertion of our rights to protect the land.
Hmm.
So, what I'm also proud to talk about is that Wiikwemkoong is one of the leading nations in Canada for language revitalization, particularly Anishinaabe. There are a lot of immersion camps popping up in Wiikwemkoong and in this territory where young people, even younger than me, are now becoming fluent in about 2 years' time. And it's really something to be proud of and such an incredible way to revitalize the paradigms and the perspectives that our people understand when it comes to protecting the land. So
Hmm.
those are just some of my perspectives on kinship and like what has made
Yeah.
me who I am, basically.
There's a lot I want to unpack in there, and that call out and absolutely love kind of that, language revitalization, right? And so I come from a remote northern Saskatchewan community, and I think we connected on, I think I presented on, Minimumatsuan, and it's interesting, we have a mutual connection, and I had the same kind of engagement with Jen Bennett, right, in regards to, Cree and Chimwin, Anishinaabe, like, there's with Ojibwe and OG Cree, there's certainly some language consistencies as part of the same group, but lots to unpack there. But one of the things you talked about too is coming from a community that has had a historical tenuous relationship with resource development, but that has evolved. And so I think a lot of people understand the historical context, but not a lot of people probably understand what's happened since and how does that inform things. And I want to talk about that later. But first, I'm always absolutely inspired, like by you. You're certainly an outlier, a trailblazer. You are an Indigenous engineer. You're a professional engineer, and you're working in the oil and natural gas industry. And you're a female Indigenous engineer, right? So even more of a kind of an underrepresented kind of demographic. And it's and then to see the things that you do with the confidence that you have is absolutely inspiring and should inspire everyone. So tell us about this journey. What sparked your choice, in engineering? What sparked your choice to work for, an oil and natural gas company, one of the largest companies in the world? And so how did all this come together, and how did you end up where you are as an engineer and in the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, for sure. I actually love telling this story because it's so strange.
I
But
love strange stories. Love
yeah.
them. They're more interesting.
So I started off my career definitely not from nothing. My parents are incredibly intelligent people who made massive strides for our family. When I look back along the generations of my family and where we were impacted by residential schools, it's almost like looking at a line and seeing a dent. And then understanding that my parents were at the edge of the dent and pulled us back into what we were meant for, where we were meant to stand in our greatness as a people. And my parents did a lot of that hard work. My dad was actually an electrician first, and then he became an electrical engineer after he got injured and he couldn't be an electrician anymore. And when he was going to engineering school, actually at Lakehead over in Thunder Bay, I was like 3 or 4, and my parents had to bring me to school with them sometimes. And so I actually went to engineering school as a baby with my dad. And I remember some of my earliest memories were him actually doing his capstone project. I spent a ton of time in the engineering library. Those librarians knew me when I graduated from university myself. They said, "I remember your dad. That is so funny." And so I would say my dad had a pretty significant impact on me in engineering. In terms of like the political space, the first time that I really got involved in politics was a long time ago when I worked at the band office in Wiki,
Yeah.
and they didn't have a recycling system at the time, and I was really getting into like, okay, like we have to take care of the land, so we have to really recycle. And then I wrote this letter to some band administrators, and I was like pretty like, I don't know, feisty, fiery. And I was like, we really
Yeah.
need a recycling system immediately. And I started getting involved in that way. But then as I got to know more First Nation people and connect with more of my community in the Sudbury region, I actually became an environmental activist. I got a ton of activist training. I blocked roads. I ran anti-pipeline protests. I traveled to Seattle to do former Vice President Al Gore's climate reality training. And when I went there, I met other Indigenous people and learned that in other engineering schools, like up in Alaska, that most of the Indigenous students who were in engineering were actually women. And I think it's because of this pretty significant resurgence of culture and how many Indigenous cultures are matriarchal. And because engineering requires such a significant level of leadership and leadership skills, then it ended up naturally coming out of the resurgence of our culture. And so I do feel like that, like resurgence of culture paired with the incredible leadership from my parents and the healing of our family line following the impact of residential and day schools, that I was able to find my way into engineering. And it was hard. Like I had mental health struggles in school. And when I first started school, the supports that I needed weren't actually there. So I like to tell people that I failed out because I think there's a lot of other Indigenous students that think if they fail that they just can't make it, because schools are already, inherently not designed for us. Many of them are in some state of healing themselves from, not being built for Indigenous people. It was such a significant source of harm for our people. And so I failed out and I went to college. And on the first day of college, there was this professor there who saw my failing grades from university and said, I don't know what happened here, but you're going to do amazing here. And I believe in you. And this man did not know me. And I cried. I was like, I don't even
Mm-hmm.
believe in me. I don't know how this guy believes in me. And so what my plan was at that time was to do a year of college, go back to engineering school and try again. But I ended up loving it. I got straight A's all the way through an advanced diploma in engineering technology at Cambrian College. And I graduated from that program and it was so empowering. Like I found my voice, I found self-confidence in myself during that time. There were a lot of cultural supports like from the Wobnode Center at Cambrian College that were far ahead of the kind of supports I was getting at university
Mm-hmm.
previously. And I was really successful. I got 2 internships before I left the college. One was at a mining lab in northern China, where I lived for over 4 months in a metallurgical lab. Well, I lived on a university campus, but I worked at a metallurgical lab. And then I came
Oof,
back.
I was worried there. Yeah. Yeah. Kind of
Um,
experiments. Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, and then I came back and I worked at a cement plant that was using recycled material for mine sloping cement
Mm-hmm.
mixes.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked at that, and that was an incredible technical experience for me. And then I went back to university. And it was hard getting back into university because I did not want to move away from my family in the Sudbury region, but I had previously failed. And so I applied and they denied me. I actually got rejected. I think it was 2 or 3 times I got rejected from the engineering
Mm-hmm.
program. They tried to put me in liberal arts, and I said, no, I have straight A's in college. There's no reason I can't be successful now. So I had to get 11 letters from various technical peers and people I had worked with. And I think one of the executives from the college also wrote me like a letter of recommendation. And then
Mm-hmm.
the dean of engineering at my university was finally like, I don't know why you didn't get accepted. Like, here you go. You can be in the engineering school. So I
Yeah.
finally got accepted. And around this time was the time that my political and I guess protesting advocacy really peaked. I
Mm-hmm.
was very involved in that
Mm-hmm.
space.
Mm-hmm.
360.org is an organization that I worked with a lot. They actually are very anti-oil and gas,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a lot to do with mitigating the impacts of climate change. So I did really well from then on in
Yeah.
university, A's and B's. And I was walking down the hallway one day at my university campus, and the director of engineering walks by me, and he's like, "Hey, I noticed you doing really good. Do you want to be in the co-op program?" And I was like, absolutely, I do. So I was in the co-op program by the next day, threw my resume in a hat, and I got an interview at Union Gas, which was owned by Enbridge at the time. This was in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, there's no way. Like, I
Yeah.
can't go to this interview. I'll be drinking the Kool-Aid. And I just can't do this. What would it look like? What would people think of me? And so I was really thinking about it. And I definitely, I was very close to not going to that interview. So I did some research on the company and learned that they are doing a couple of things that I thought was really interesting. One was using biogas generators or pressure vessels to create methane gas as a biofuel and transporting that in their pipelines. And it was carbon neutral. And then the other thing they were doing was doping the gas with hydrogen to reduce methane emissions by the use of hydrogen. And I was like, I did not expect that. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't expect an oil and gas company to be working on something that had to do with the reduction of emissions, that had to do with taking care of the land and taking care of the atmosphere. And so I was like, okay, I'll give them a shot. And I did research about the company. I had 2 interviews. One was technical, and the second one was about my personality.
Mm-hmm.
And in the personality interview, the interviewer asked me this one last question at the end of the interview, and it was, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And it was like someone else was talking. Like, I don't even know where this answer came from because it wasn't something that I thought of myself, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And my answer was, I would like to help lead the energy transition in a way where I can weave my Anishinaabe cultural values into engineering. And I've been doing that ever since. That has been the motto of my career. And that's not something that I ever expected to be doing. I ended up landing this 16-month internship and quickly learned that people that make up the oil and gas industry aren't what I expected.
Hmm.
They don't want to pollute. They don't want to destroy the land. They're good people that want to learn about Indigenous people. We had, like, I don't think I've ever been given more resources to teach other people about our culture and about residential schools than I
Hmm.
have compared to what I've been given in this career.
Hmm.
It's unbelievable how much support that I've been afforded, and the things that I've been able to do are pretty incredible. Like throughout my entire, I've been at Enbridge for almost 7 years now, and it's been like being in an atmosphere where I can start my own business.
Hmm.
Except I'm working at Enbridge. They just kind
Yeah.
of like I'll pitch things and they'll let me do what I feel that I need to
Hmm.
do.
Hmm.
And that's been pretty incredible. I've run a number of programs that I've created myself. One of them I'm really proud of is called the Mwanjwe Leadership Program. It means bringing people together program. And basically, what we do is we bring frontline operations technicians, technical staff, engineers to residential schools, and they spend a full day there learning about the culture, learning about teachings, and they meet survivors of the residential school to learn about the impact that these places have had on our communities. And another program that I'm very proud that I'm doing now is I pitched an emissions reduction program for construction, and basically, it applies to storage and transmission, where we do a number of different things to systemically reduce methane emissions in storage and transmission construction projects, as well as scoping out system improvements for reducing emissions. So I've been allowed to like just make up stuff to do, and it's worked out pretty well for me. So
Yeah, no kidding.
I
Yeah.
really like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wouldn't. Yeah, I love the use of your language, and certainly you come from a place where you're incredibly capable, and so it's not like you're manifesting something out of thin air. You're coming at it from depth and experience and perspective, a different perspective. So that's really incredible. There's so much here. I see part two and part three of this. I'm gonna try. Like I know there's some things I want to ask you, but everything else is you're adding so much depth and color to a lot of the things. But one of the things, and you mentioned this, and we talked a little bit about this in terms of your culture and how does that shape your work. But you did mention something I really want to capture. I get to do a lot of advocacy, and I entered the resource space as an environmentalist, right? And so wanting to kind of change things from within, already having kind of a long-standing relationship, familial relationship with, resource development industry, but also wanted to come at it from a stewardship perspective and, and then evolved and everything like that. But I got an appreciation, and you talked about this, if I wanted to see change, I was much better suited to do it from within, taking samples and informing and continual improvement and through practice and through the different ways I was getting involved. I've spent time with activists, and it's really interesting, the things I think that were called in regards to like working in resource development and trying to push the needle on reconciliation and good and everything like that. But at the end of the day, world is demanding resources, and I feel like the obligation is let's lean into doing it really well, sustainably, taking care of the land and still developing, and moving that forward. And my practice is certainly informed by my cultural values. But tell us a little bit more about how your cultural values, and you did give us some great examples. You talked about those cool programs informed from your perspective, but how does that shape your approach to your work and leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. One example that I like to look back on, and one that I talk about with my students, actually, there's two that I'll talk about with you, but the first one is humility. So, humility is one of the seven sacred teachings of the
Mm-hmm.
Anishinaabe, just like they are for many
Yep.
other Indigenous cultures in Canada and the US. But the Anishinaabe word for humility is Daba Den Dizwin. And the teaching that I got from a knowledge holder, his name is Elton Beardy in Northern Ontario, is that when you break down the word, humility is not just, it's almost like calling in your humanity. And that's the way that we understand that from
Mm-hmm.
a Western perspective. But from an Anishinaabe perspective, it means like lowering yourself to the ground and also understanding that you are nothing without the light of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to humility, there are studies out of Haskell in Calgary and many other institutions that talk about how humility in a leader is the most critical thing that the leader can have in order to promote and ensure the success of their team. And
Yeah.
imagine if you understood humility not just as that, as this like critical predictor of success, but also in a way where you are understanding that the land is critically important to the safety of the people. And you and I have had this conversation before
Yeah.
in engineering, where every single code of conduct for engineers and any legislation when it comes to mining and energy, the first number one priority is safety.
Mm-hmm.
So like think about a leader that has true humility. If you insert Anishinaabe paradigms, it expands our understanding of humility to include the safety of the land. And that is so important. That is the kind of culture that needs to be injected into the industry in order for us to direct it in the way of energy transition, and in a way that expands our safety culture.
Mm-hmm.
Another one that I like to talk about, and that we talked about in one of my classes to my students on design thinking, is Bizindan, which is the Anishinaabe word for listen, like you're
Mm-hmm.
listening to somebody. But
Mm-hmm.
when you break down the word, it's actually this 4-part word where you're listening with more than just your ears, you're listening with your entire body. And
Mm-hmm.
you are listening to the entire body of another person, including the settings
Yeah.
and more than what they just say,
Yeah.
which means that, that's injecting values-based leadership in listening to other people.
Yeah.
And when you look at the statistics of how business is successful, 60% of like entrepreneurial pursuits fail because people
Mm-hmm.
solve problems that were not real problems. They
Mm-hmm.
just they didn't listen to people. That's
Mm-hmm.
the problem.
Yeah.
And so injecting this values-based paradigm into the way that we listen to people and we do things like empathy mapping, like agile approaches, it really amps up our ability to serve people in a way that
Mm-hmm.
works for people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a priority for all engineers. Our
Yeah.
work needs to connect with people. People need to be able to use what we put
Yeah.
together. It needs
Mm-hmm.
to be safe for them. And as engineers, we can lose sight of that. It's easy to lose sight of that for anyone, really.
Absolutely. I think if I'm critical, one of the areas I'm critical is, as a profession, we're far too pedantic, right? And so, in Cree, when you mentioned that, it just kind of gave me kind of the hairs kind of standing up because I was thinking of Nahe Tamuin and Nisto Tamuin, right? And so, which is understanding and hearing. And so, and so internalizing and know as I know, see as I see, know as you know, see as you see, right? And so there's a whole, there's so much more than just in English hearing, right? And it's a literal thing, but in our languages, it's much more. It's a relationship and it's a process, and that's one of the reasons why I think I engaged in writing about Minimamatsu and Creek Code of Ethics and everything like that, is because I wanted to reconcile my worldview with, again, like we talked about this, I think, at great lengths, and how codes are often too prescriptive and too much duty based. And when we see the evolution now, but it's inspiring to see Indigenous people lean in and into their values, and then how it's not a zero sum game. It strengthens, right? It really does. And so it's not to replace, and it's not to say it's better. It's just adding depth and dimension, and it's something for everyone. It's not just for Indigenous engineers. Ethics of character and virtue and practices of character and virtue are certainly a benefit to anyone and everyone, as they should be. So super cool, and we could probably talk about that for the whole hour, which is awesome. But one of the obvious things is, as an Indigenous woman, you're certainly in a male-dominated industry. What are some of the challenges you faced? How do you navigate those?
It's hard. I would
Hmm.
say one of the primary things that has held me up over the years is having mentors. They're men who are very good at allyship. And
Hmm.
sometimes I refer to them as girl dads because that's kind of who they are. They're
Yeah,
like,
that's
okay,
me.
girl
That's
dad,
me.
cool,
Yeah,
girl dad style,
yeah.
or just powerful women. A
Hmm.
lot of women have held me up in my life, including my mom.
Hmm.
She's like, she will pick me up by the scruff and tell me to keep
Hmm.
going,
Yeah,
that's been really inspiring for me.
yeah.
And it's very funny, like, to lean on my family so much because they recognize my patterns of grief. They're like, "Oh, she's gonna freak out about it, and then she's gonna recover, and then she'll be fine." So
Yeah.
It's fine. So that's been pretty great. But I would say if you are a young woman going into engineering, recognize that it is hard for everyone, not just you, and not just because you're a girl. Engineering is really hard for everyone. The second thing is if you have a female mentor who has been through or similarly been through what you have been through, they are going to be an invaluable resource to you. So
Hmm.
on days when I thought I was crazy for feeling something about some situation, or I felt that something was particularly difficult and I didn't, you kind of get into this space of like almost gaslighting yourself. You're like, why can't I
Hmm.
just deal with this better? But then you talk to your mentor and she's like, no, that's actually terrible. That's terrible. And the other thing that I've learned in the past couple of years of my career is that early on in my career, if I was going through it with a male coworker, like conflict situations where they're yelling at you, it's a skill to be able to learn how to deal with situations like that.
Yes.
Um, it is confidence is a skill that you have to practice. It's worth studying. It's not
Yeah.
something that you magically inherently get.
Hmm.
To get the level of confidence that I have now, I not only had to lean on my family and my mentors, but I read books about it. What is
Hmm.
confident body language? What
Hmm.
is confident speaking? You
Hmm.
know, I got speaking training, I got communication training, I got writing training. I learned how to practice things and I learned how to prioritize even the smallest things that make me feel more comfortable.
Hmm.
And there are micro behaviors that I learned from other very powerful women that really inspire me too. Like the other day, a woman who I greatly respect and admire, she's also very powerful. She asked me what name I prefer to be called. And I said, Kayla is fine. And she's like, no, what do you prefer?
Hmm.
And I was like, wow, this lady sets boundaries and sets expectations immediately, even when they're small. And when you do that, people around you follow suit.
Hmm.
And if they don't follow suit, then they're probably not worth having in your circle. So it's really interesting learning how to have boundaries with other people and boundaries with yourself on setting high expectations for how people treat and respect you.
Hmm.
So that is a skill that you have to learn from other people and
Hmm.
from study.
Yeah. No, I hear confidence, but I also hear, a high sense of dignity and resilience. You know what I mean? And so I can certainly hear that in how you present yourself. Yes, absolutely the confidence there, but I mean, yeah, the resilience to have dealt with things and then confidence to be able to move past them. And it's incredibly impressive. Yeah, like I said, I'm always inspired. So, through that, I reflect on my experience, and it's probably ironic. A lot of my advocacy is actually not geared towards kind of indigenous inclusion. It's geared towards for those who are not necessarily binary, or for women in underrepresented spaces. I think some time ago in my career, I had some really, really profound experiences where I had to challenge my bias and my privilege. I'm a big white passing dude, and then really understanding that, especially in a mining environment, and trying to understand what experiences do at the time, what experiences are women having, and how do they feel safe, and having them feel safe to talk about it. And I think, yeah, a lot of the work I did in terms of being a sincere, genuine ally was actually more in those spaces. Publicly, yeah, I talk about indigenous inclusion all the time, but a lot of times the work that I do, so I think allies are really important, and we have to create spaces for people like that. That's incredibly important. But yeah, confidence, yeah, you have it, and then you've learned it well, and I hope a lot of people, a lot of people will understand that. Yeah, you practice, you learn, you study on it, right? And so I was pretty shy. I was not necessarily as confident, and then not necessarily even that good of a communicator. And you learn, you practice, and you get confident in those skills. So loving hearing it, love seeing it, love seeing you everywhere that you go, and then you could really see that. In regards to some of the barriers that Indigenous professional faced, what are some of those in terms of trying to progress into senior roles?
Yeah, I would say in oil and gas, Indigenous technical professionals are incredibly underrepresented in executive roles. I actually don't think I have met any at a major company. Companies like Enbridge, Synovus, TC Energy, I haven't seen a senior Indigenous person like in the C suite.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that one of the things that has been incredibly inspiring for me is that two Anishinaabe people who have gotten onto boards. So Don Madabi Leach is on the board of TC Energy, which was mind blowing for me. I was like, she's from like the same area as I'm from in the Robinson Huron Treaty Territory. And then JP Gladue is on the board of Suncor. So that has been incredibly inspiring for me. I also know that there are some companies that have Indigenous advisory groups that advise their boards. And I think that's fantastic as well. Mining companies have that as well. So that's been a positive for me. It's even less so, though, in terms of representation for Indigenous women at those levels. And I think a lot of those spaces still need a lot more allyship in terms of understanding that Indigenous people are experts in their own portfolios. So one major problem that I'm seeing like across energy and mining is non-Indigenous people managing all of the Indigenous work. And I think there is a space that they can take up when it comes to allyship, but there are so many Indigenous people that have degrees and a high level of education and experience that deserve those roles because they have the kinship with the communities, they have the cultural background and understanding, and because our people still do not trust people who are not from our communities. And if they don't trust you inherently, it's going to be way harder for the company to have business success when it comes to connecting with Indigenous communities, which is absolutely fundamental to your business's success, especially in energy and mining. And so that's a big sticking point for me. It is improving quite significantly, I would say. Even in my short career so far, I've seen leaps and bounds of improvement, but I still want to see improvement in those spaces.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and yeah, it's it's incredible. I think of all the Indigenous representation, and yes, there absolutely needs to be more, because there's huge business value, there's insight, there's connection. It's certainly not tokenism. It's just representation. We have these organizations which have a majority of their operations in Indigenous territory, and you need help navigating that space, especially now where it's absolutely essential to develop those partnerships and relationships with communities to be able to advance development interests, right? And I think about back home working for Cameco for years and always had an Indigenous person on their board and Lac La Ronge Indian Band, and then it's back to Chief Tammy Cook-Searson, who's on Cameco's board now. But yeah, a lot of the energy companies, but there's still so much more companies without that representation, right? In C-suite, and yeah, it's a miss, right? So there's huge opportunities there. One of the, this is a really interesting question. I love getting into this discussion and debate. I spent some time in the energy industry, more on the service side, and not necessarily in the operations and producer side, and most of my experience is in mining. And so, the oil and natural gas sector certainly faces a lot of criticism and a lot of stigma. And you talked about that, right? And so, and we don't necessarily know, and from within, like, these are good people and they're trying to do their best, and they're, doing all sorts of things in terms of innovation and everything like that. But in regards to that criticism and stigma, how do you navigate those challenges and while advocating for Indigenous involvement, while still very much participating and supporting the industry?
Right. This is a great question. So back in 2018, when I first got hired to Union Gas, which was owned by Enbridge,
Mm-hmm.
I posted a Facebook photo of myself with a photo of my name tag, my Union Gas name tag, and I was kind of holding it like this, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
and there was
Mm-hmm.
a Union Gas sign behind me, and I was very proud that I got this engineering internship. I had a lot of hateful comments. There was actually a well-known activist, I won't name who it was, but they wrote this kind of long excerpt about how I was a sellout and that I wasn't a real native, and a lot of other hateful things. And someone in my community who I had actually gone to ceremony with told me that they couldn't be my friend anymore, and that they told me that I wasn't a real native, and then they blocked me. So I've had a lot of reactions like that. I've had a lot of reactions where people avoid me, and then when they hear me talk about what the work that I'm doing to actually protect the land and reduce emissions, then they approach me after that. So that was like early on in my career when I was actually getting a lot of hateful comments. Now I would say, like, when I started experiencing that, my initial reaction was to pull back. And it took me a long time to recover from the shame of working in this industry, because I had this leftover shame from being a protester, from all the injustice that our people have experienced as a result of, extractive industries, mining, oil and gas, and other energy. And for years, I felt that. About 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. And a couple of years ago, I actually had a chance to work with the Honorable Marie Sinclair Iban, and we delivered this talk at Avatar Innovations. And basically what the program was, a business competition for, I think there was 300 oil and gas young professionals, engineers, technicians, business developers, and they were developing ideas for the energy transition in oil and gas. And so I worked for Avatar Innovations, and I created part of the program that had to do with reconciliation and Anishinaabe paradigms in the energy transition. And I delivered a talk with JP Gladue and the Honorable Marie Sinclair Iban. Before we delivered that talk, I had a one-on-one with him where I told him how I felt. I told him about the shame that I felt, but I also told him that I really believed in my work. And what he said to me was that, Kaella, like, I want you to know that when I first became a lawyer and worked for the government, people had the exact same experience. I had the exact same experience.
Collateral
People called
violence.
me a
Yeah.
sellout. Yeah,
Visceral reaction.
it was the exact same thing. He was like, people called me a sellout. They said hateful stuff to me, but I just kept going. Now he's known as the Titan of reconciliation. He changed the justice system from inside of it. And he brought to light some of the most significant humanitarian travesties on the planet, which was the residential and day schools, and started this movement of justice for our people. And he said, you need to be where you are and keep doing what you're doing. And I will never forget that. That really changed my life. And when it comes to, living and working in oil and gas, it's not what I expected. I think and of course there's always exceptions to what I think generally, but what I think is that a lot of conflict stems from people just not understanding what is happening in the industry. There are fundamental things that I am working very hard to change, like emissions, like the nature of the fuels, like residential renewables and localization of energy and the energy supply chain, which is mining and electrification. The critical path to electrification is mining. You just can't have energy transition without mining. What I've learned is that I think when you are inside of it and trying to apply that Bazindan to the people who are inside of it, that it really puts things into a much more in-depth context, where you then have to consider, how can I write the story of a just energy transition, and how can I do this without harming people? And I think 6 or 7 years ago, before I was in the industry, and someone said we should go full electrification tomorrow, I would have 100% been on that bandwagon. But now I'm like, okay, some of the most incredible innovators on emissions reduction that I know on the front line are people who have been in pipelines for 30 years and fed their family that way for generations. And so do I want to antagonize those people? No, that's harm to them. Do I want to antagonize the opportunity for Northern Ontario First Nations to develop their business parks because they can't rely on electrical sources at that time because the infrastructure is just not there? No. There is nuance inside of energy transition that we really need to understand, so that we're not harming our own people and we're not harming others. And so, at times I often try to think about what the really correct words are when it comes to my work. But I think the most correct is harm reducing the energy transition and trying to carve and make the way for people to create a new energy future, which is going to take a long time, because we don't want to harm people in the process. That's why it's so hard.
Yeah, Absolutely. Like it is incredibly complex. And, I really got kind of thrust into the discussion, especially in my role operationally with with the Indigenous Resource Network. And, I had the benefit of having, 20 some years kind of behind me and a lot of different kind of experiences. And then being objective, right? And then kind of looking at it. And so there was a lot of fundamentals right away coming in and understanding this is much more complex and it's not that easy. Been to presentations. Yes, we want to build a transmission line from here to here. I was like, wow, do you know the landscape? Do what is the amount of energy, resources, emissions to do that project versus what if we were to do isolated project? Is it the right solution? Is it objective? Once we depoliticize and actually talk about what is the most meaningful in terms of environmental footprint and impact, is that the actual best use of time, money, effort, and resources, right? And so there's better ways to do things. And I think you look at things much the same perspective, values approach, but also from a very technically competent perspective as well too. Yeah, there's probably there is so much there. Also know the world needs resources and we cannot transition from energy types. Yes, we absolutely need to, and we need to do that, but we need to do that in a harm reducing way. And, what is our net impact if we were to move from one to the other, if we were to ask people to do this thing and versus that? And is there the possibility of rolling back reconciliation, rolling back, and further regressing into, areas of abject poverty and, dealing with some of those incredible issues? And yes, it's complicated and you can't turn the switch and, we're not necessarily built that way. The other thing that was, I think, alarming for me is as I got to understand how Canada and how we do it and energy and everything like that, we're leaders on so many fronts and we're just motivated that way. But it's tough when we're in a world market, not the same standards in terms of sustainability and in terms of footprint and everything like that. And, there's additional pressures there as well too. And all these things kind of considered, it's an incredibly wicked problem. It's a complex problem. And I think the people who are making true headway are, of course, the people within the industry and the people with the values approach that you have that are really rethinking how we do things, how we still produce, how we're still profitable, but we're doing it in different ways that ensure we're more sustainable, more responsible, and all those aspects. And it makes me feel really good. There's people like you. I get to talk to a lot of people, and it's inspiring to know that there's these bright spots all over the place, right? That are really making institutional and systemic change. So that's super cool. We don't have a ton of time left, but there's a couple things I really want to talk about. I think one of them is kind of come back to how do you talked about confidence, and you talked about making space for people, in that place. But how would you get, and maybe this will follow up because I get the chance to speak to a lot of young STEM people, aspiring, interested, and even new to post-secondary experienced students, but I'm super interested in terms of what advice you would give. You go to a primary or secondary and you're talking to young Indigenous people. How would you approach them pursuing a career in engineering, energy, oil and natural gas, natural resources?
Yeah. So I've been talking to young people actually a lot in the last couple months, which is probably one of the high points of my career was teaching young engineering students, going to the Skills Ontario gathering that it was Skills Ontario and the North Shore Tribal Council recently had an incredible gathering over in Sault Ste. Marie where they hosted 1,200 young First Nation students. And there was a really great skills fair, and Leslie Hampton, the famous fashion designer, was there, and she delivered a keynote. And then I also spoke last November at the Ontario First Nation Technical Services Corporation, which is
Mm-hmm.
led by Melanie DeBossegay. So they have like a youth STEM summit,
Mm-hmm.
and I spoke to 200 young First Nation high schoolers, and I tend to tell them a couple of main things. The first one is don't be scared of failure because you're going to fail. Every single person who has ever succeeded in anything has
Yeah.
failed at it a million times first.
Oh,
You're going to
absolutely.
get 100
First to
no's
admit.
and one yes. All you need is
Yeah.
one yes, and then
Yes.
your career will accelerate. You
Yeah.
just have to keep trying
Yeah.
to find the yes.
Yeah.
And, that's it. You just
Yeah.
keep trying.
Failure is an instrumental part of success, right? It absolutely part of
Yeah.
it. You will never
It's the
succeed
only
if you never experience failure. It's learning how to move past failure and beyond that. And so I love hearing that. Lucky kids, lucky
Absolutely.
kids.
You are gonna fail. I have failed a million times. And I tell people that I have failed a
And
million times because I
yeah.
have incredible success now. And they're like, wow, she's a genius. She must work so hard. I'm like,
Mhm.
no, I just didn't stop trying. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
only thing. I'm not special. You could do anything, any of the things that I am doing.
Yeah.
Things are hard, they're just hard.
Yeah.
Engineering is hard. And so you're gonna fail at it a bunch, but just keep going.
Yeah.
And don't take no for an answer, just keep going.
Absolutely. I
Um,
love that. Like, I think I said the same thing about 20 years ago. Actually, I was just about finishing my engineering undergrad, and I was in a remote northern Canadian community, far northern Saskatchewan. So not quite, not NWT or anything, but it was far northern Saskatchewan. And I was talking to a class, and they were asking me, is engineering hard? And I was like, wow. And then, it's like, okay, this is probably a chance to either inspire them or to break them and break the possibility, right? And so, and then I told them, I said, yes, it's hard. But hard is so relative. Like, and I said, let me tell you something. I said, if I brought an engineering professor to your community and asked them to live and survive, they wouldn't. They'd perish. And very quickly, these are incredibly, tons of experience in their fields and specialists and everything, and did all these things you would call hard. But hard is relative. You keep persevere and you keep moving through. You find those supports. Said a lot of the things I think that you mentioned, and yeah, like it's certainly it's all relative, right? And so
yeah.
one of the things I love to talking to young people about is I always ask them, I always ask young people, what do you want to do? What do you want to do with your life and everything like that? And do I have answers? No, I'm asking you because I might, I'm looking for ideas as well too. And
Tell
that's that,
me, I don't know
yeah,
either.
yeah, exactly. And that's because we will, don't get so hung up on one thing or that's what I want to identify, career. Identify with your values and everything makes sense after that. And really lean into that and then your career will evolve. It will change. You will never, there's very few people who do the same thing over and over and over. Just lean into those, find happiness, and then, just make some choices. And they're not going to be your forever choices, but just move forward.
Absolutely. The
Hmm.
other thing I like to tell them is to not take themselves too seriously because
Right?
that was a problem I had earlier
Yeah.
in my like when I was my shyest. It was
Yeah.
because I was taking myself so seriously. I was
Yeah.
like, if you just become silly and like get over your fear of
Yeah.
like social failure and you're just ridiculous and authentically yourself,
Yeah.
the best things will happen to you and come to you naturally.
Absolutely.
So do stuff that like
Yeah.
builds up that like almost silliness gene,
Hmm.
like I
Yeah.
have a friend who did like clown school. I've done theater, parliament theater and like
Hmm.
local theater, improv. Anything that helps you be more silly, I think like brings out the best in you and helps you be more authentic.
Yeah.
And that like is so helpful.
It is.
And that's a skill that you have to work on.
Yeah, and building confidence and everything like that, right? Absolutely. Like just yeah, that authenticity, right? That it's incredibly important to people. And there's, I think it's an easier way to kind of tell young people that it's how you self-determine and you find your authentic self and you be your authentic self and don't worry about being accepted or fitting into norms or everything like that. And I have had a very similar experience where I think my life has been much more fulfilling when I just show up authentically me. The Indian doesn't get left anywhere. Doesn't get left in the cupboard. Doesn't get left at the door. It's like yeah,
Yeah,
and every other part of me, every other part, not just that part, right? And so yes, absolutely, love to have fun, big goof, everything like that. I take my work incredibly seriously, but not myself. And have a lot
exactly.
of yeah, and why we should be right. And so it's yeah, absolutely, we can do serious things and be serious and do serious work, but at the same time, we got to have fun along the way and not necessarily take ourselves seriously. Very cool. Yes, we're kind of getting to the top of that time there, and I've had an absolute good time. I didn't get through the questions I wanted to, because we just had too much fun with the thoughts. I think the thoughts that were kind of inspired throughout this process, but we had so much fun talking about the things we did. Love hearing your approach, really values oriented approach. And, you talked a lot about the reasons why you do things. And there is something there that I absolutely love talking to people, and especially as I talk to Indigenous people, that is quite consistent. Is we're compelled to serve our values and serve our community and serve purpose, right? In terms of looking after community, looking after the land and then absolutely doing it in a meaningful, authentic way. And it's absolutely inspiring. So I think one of the things I wanted to ask you quickly is, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for Indigenous people and communities in our evolving energy landscape in oil and natural gas?
So I think the business opportunities are obvious. Obviously, part of self-determination is the development and ramp up of entrepreneurial pursuits for Indigenous people. But
Mm-hmm.
one other thing that I don't see enough of, especially in like Central and Eastern Canada, is actually Indigenous oversight.
Mm-hmm.
So out west, I've had the incredible privilege of working with two people that I really respect. Richard Asakin, who is the chair of the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee for Enbridge Line 3, and
Mm-hmm.
also Raymond Cardinal, who is the Indigenous Caucus Chair for the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee for TMX.
Mm-hmm.
And what these two gentlemen have done from years of experience in oil and gas is help co-create these organizations called the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committees. And they're called committees, but they're not really committees. They're really more like operational groups. And what
Mm-hmm.
they do is they go through the experience of being involved with a major project. So they're out on the ground experiencing exactly what's happening. They're doing environmental and archaeological monitoring. They are doing a variety of different environmental assessments. One that was particularly striking to me was the Indigenous monitors on the IAMC for TMX were doing things like reducing the impact to cedar trees along the
Mm-hmm.
right of way of the pipeline because they're culturally relevant. And they also do things like compliance verification activities, so
Yeah.
CVAs, when it comes to the regulatory conditions that are imposed on an oil and gas or any energy company when they're trying to get federal permitting to do the
Mm-hmm.
work. Conditions get put in place as a result of the issuance of the permit that they have to follow. So compliance verification activities are basically making sure that they're following all the rules. And what the IMCs do is they are trying to take all of their frontline learnings from, I think they've been operating for maybe over a decade in some cases, but install those into the conditions of the work, which
Mm-hmm.
means that our people get a say in the way that these companies are allowed to operate,
Yeah.
which is an assertion of our rights. And they don't, like, the IMCs do not make decisions. They actually, to me, they are the mechanism of free and prior informed consent.
Yeah.
They don't provide the consent part. They provide the free and prior informed part,
Mm-hmm.
which is a critical gap. And that is what Indigenous oversight can provide to
Mm-hmm.
communities is, and it'll provide jobs too, but this is the technical information that is Indigenous led and gathered by Indigenous people and made accessible to our governments.
Mm-hmm.
This entire process acts as an assertion of our rights because we
Yeah.
have those rights. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I want to mention is actually um, our rights because of Bill C-15, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So part of what triggers free and prior informed consent is a release of hazardous materials into the environment. And one thing that I am working on is actually helping more Indigenous people understand that they have the right to know about methane emissions, which you cannot see. You
Yeah.
can't see methane emissions. And so
Mm-hmm.
when assets are operating near your territory or on your territory, you have a right to ask what those emissions are for any hazardous chemical. And methane is classified as a hazardous material by the federal government. And so you have a right to ask about it. And you should.
Mm-hmm.
What is
Mm-hmm.
it? You know? And
Mm-hmm.
if you're asking about it, then that further incents oil and gas companies to work on it. So that's
Huge
one
opportunity.
major,
Yeah.
yeah, major important part for me. Indigenous people have the right to know about the emissions, and there are jobs associated with looking at emissions. That's a big innovation space right now.
Absolutely. And then, the more we know, the more we can do about it, right? And then there is a willingness to do about it. I think that's another stigma. There's certainly a willingness and a desire and more engagement. Yeah, it kind of brings that around full circle. Well, thank you so much, Kayla, for your insights. Incredibly valuable. Thank you for gifting them to me and to us, and of course to our listeners, right? And so we're very honored that you would share the time with us today. So, I hope you've enjoyed, I hope everyone enjoyed today's episode of Indigenous Voices and Resource Development. Please, if you, our listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It's an absolute honor talking with Kaella, but I say Kaella, I don't know, I just read it and I say that Kaella, the E is silent, or K, yeah, and so it's just a different way of spelling it. People call me Jahan all the time, so I don't mind. But Kaella, thank you so much, Kaella, for joining us on today's episode. And this won't be the last time we chat, and maybe there'll be another part to it, and maybe we'll have another project together because you're just that interesting, you're that inspiring, and more people need to hear your perspective and to be guided by your leadership. So thank you so much.
Miigwech for having me, John. Ani Kinawea. I'm Kaella-Marie Earle from Wiikwemkoong First Nation, and I'm a proud member of the Indigenous Resource Network.